we are not actually that far in figuring out the constructive aspect of it. How is consciousness actually built from the ground up? And, it's hard for me to imagine ever getting to a point where science can actually say, you can actually build consciousness from the ground up to the point of the human brain. There really seems to be still something kind of inaccessible about the essence of the human brain. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that. It's really understanding how it's constructed.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with Sara Manning Peskin about her engrossing new book, A Molecule Away from Madness, Tales of the Hijacked Brain. Riveting stories, really, of the brain on the brink, as they say, patients suffering extraordinarily mental impairment, accompanied by fascinating stories of scientists who made key discoveries in solving the medical mysteries. I really loved reading it. Welcome, Sara. What's a hijacked brain?
So I guess we could think about it in lots of sorts of ways, but in the book, I really talk about it as brains that have been co-opted by single molecules. And so we have this idea of our brains being very resilient, and they are, but there are all sorts of diseases where a single type of molecule can actually overthrow our entire system. And so the book really captures those diseases, both what's the patient experience and also how did scientists figure out, what was going on? And the idea is that this really lays the groundwork for how we're going to cure more common things. So this is how we're going to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease and, Parkinson's disease and all these other things. It's on the basis of these more rare conditions.
Yeah, I love the way you interspersed in each category the patients in some depth. We really got to know them. They became our friends, and then the scientists and their struggles, oftentimes in unusual circumstances, to discover what was the problem, oftentimes ridiculed in the process.
Yeah, and I think as I was working on the book, that kind of became the name of the game. I think I had no concept of how these scientists essentially were totally unrecognized in a lot of cases,
Right.
and many of them died before they really got the recognition that they deserved.
Well, you're giving it to some of them, so we like that. Let's start by giving a kind of an overarching summary of the book in terms of your core ideas, issues, and the flow of the argument, and then the overall conclusions. Let's just do it very briefly, just for a few minutes, so we can all get oriented.
Yeah, so the idea is basically to establish that neurology is going to go the way of oncology, of cancer science. The way that they made lots of advances in treating cancer is that they started figuring out that each cancer has particular molecules, and then you find a treatment that targets that molecule. It's really hard to study the brain because you can't access it. You can't take a piece of brain tissue out and look at it under a microscope, in most cases in living people. But in these diseases that I talk about, you actually can get to a molecular diagnosis. You can figure out what molecule is causing the disease. And that's thanks to the work of these impressive scientists who, as we talked about, often went really without recognition, were ridiculed, spent all their money on this, and got not much back. And so the premise of the book is that this is the groundwork for treating the most common neurologic diseases that we all know and recognize in everyday life. And it's broken down in sort of four different categories when you think about what are the types of molecules that really cause us problems. The first I called mutants, and these are conditions that are caused by mutations in DNA. The second category I called rebels, and these are caused by proteins that have kind of gone rogue. We think of proteins basically as the workhorses of our bodies, but sometimes they can actually attack us. And then the second to last was invaders. So these are toxins and things that are there when they shouldn't be. And evaders, those are things where we need them and they're absent, and that's what causes us a problem.
Great. Well, we're going to get to each in detail. Let me first give a brief bio. Sara Manning Peskin is a cognitive neuroscientist. She is assistant professor of clinical neurology at the University of Pennsylvania. The New York Times review of her book, an excellent review, said, Peskin writes about these conditions and the patients consumed by them with a grace and humanity that recall Oliver Sacks. That's high praise indeed, Sara. That's great. What motivated you to become, as you call it, a dementia doctor?
I think as I was thinking about specialties, the best advice I got was someone said, look, when you open the exam door, who do you want to see on the table? And the exam room door, who do you want to see on the table? And I realized that what I was actually interested in is conditions where people's identities change. And we all sort of think of our brains as this thing that's very fixed. I'm an introvert or an extrovert, or I'm type A or I'm more relaxed. But it turns out that those things that we depend on are not actually as fixed as you really assume. And I really became fascinated with this idea of treating people where their identities are slowly changing. And it's both, medically interesting, it's emotionally evocative and engaging. And it's really, it's also a very social field because these play out in families. This is not a broken arm and you can set the arm and the person goes on and is fine. This is, a couple struggling with this, or, a parent and child, or a child with, a child struggling with it and their parents, watching. And so I liked all those different layers of the area.
Yeah, the issue, of course, is that because of the nature of the subject, that the prognosis in the large majority of cases, maybe almost all, is not good. So you have to live with these patients, as you've described very eloquently in the book, through this process of, and with a family of a slow or rapid decline, often to death.
Yeah, and people sort of talk about it as, someone comes into your house and steals a fork and you don't care because you have plenty of forks. And then they come in and they steal a pot, but you have other pots, and then they steal the blender. And it's just this sort of slow loss. And one of the best things that a caregiver told me was basically, it's, there's this idea of ambiguous loss in this. It's not a car crash. It's not a heart attack. It's this very slow change. And this caregiver once said to me, nobody brings over a casserole when your husband forgets your name. So it's a totally different beast than people deal with often.
Yeah.
And part of my job is kind of guiding people along that path.
Yeah, and the satisfaction you get from seeing patients when you are helping them as much as possible, and with your approach and demeanor, perhaps greatly more than most, and yet they see a constant decline. So you're part of a process in which the patient and or at least the patient's family, are not happy. And does that affect your own psychology?
So on the surface, you would think it does, but I think actually what's so redeeming about it is actually seeing how families adapt to this. I mean, some of these diseases are, some people think of them as like, this is the worst thing I could ever imagine happening to me.
Right,
Some people will
right.
say. And yet there's a resilience, and there's sort of, I think people are surprised to see that there's joy after a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. It's not that life ends. It's not that you're no longer cared for at all by the medical system. It's that this evolves. It's a moving target. New things come up all the time, and the more flexible that caregivers are, the better they actually end up doing. So actually, most of the time, it's uplifting.
Yeah, that's really great because I think we often focus on the patient. We don't focus on the physician, herself or himself. A dermatologist that I went to once told me a lament. She said that when she gives cosmetic applications, Botox or fillers or whatever, she gets enormous praise. And she was talking about a specific patient. She didn't mention the name, of course. And that what disturbed her is that one time she found at a very early stage melanoma on this patient and got it and saved her life, basically. And the patient had absolutely almost nothing to say, like, barely, wasn't even a thank you. It was like an annoyance. And so that really struck her as a very powerful indication of the human psyche, that because the filler gave an immediate positive satisfaction, the melanoma was, getting back to zero because she didn't know she had it. And then she had it and then she didn't. So she didn't appreciate what the doctor had done. And that disturbed her, disturbed the doctor.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And you sort of see that. I remember when I was in medical school, there was something that came out that the neurosurgeons had been getting sort of worse reviews from patients. And they sort of said, well, there's no nice way to say, there's no easy way to say you're going to need brain surgery. It's a tall task, and so I think it is true that you sometimes see gratitude changes, and when you give someone a diagnosis that they didn't want to ever get, they don't want the symptoms, they don't want the ramifications. Sometimes early on, you do see that sort of mix up between the care you're getting and the disease that you've gotten, and that those are coming from different sources. But most of the time, most of the patients we have and the caregivers we have are they're wonderful. They really are. They're quite devoted, and seeing them get over these bumps is actually pretty impressive.
That's great. All right, well, let's get into the book. We want to go into each of the categories. You call them molecule villains, which is kind of cute. The mutants, the rebels, the invaders, and the evaders. You told us what each means in general. So let's start with the mutants, altered DNA sequences. You use two examples. Let's discuss each of those examples a little bit. Huntington's disease and frontotemporal dementia.
So, in the chapter about Huntington's disease, one of the big stories I talk about is the story of Nancy Wexler, who's one of the preeminent Huntington's disease researchers. And she's a woman who has a pretty remarkable life story. So she was exceedingly smart, went to a wonderful school, went off and did a Fulbright scholarship, and then she's in France on vacation, and her dad calls her and says, Nancy, I'd like you to come home for my birthday. And she realizes her dad's not a sentimental guy, and she sort of very quickly realizes, something's up. This doesn't smell right. But sure enough, she flies home to California for his birthday. Her sister also meets her there, and they sit down on the couch. And her dad basically says, your mother has Huntington's disease, and you have a 50% chance of getting it. And at that moment, she basically decides that she's going to change her life around. And she was enrolling in a PhD program in psychology. And she actually decides to do her PhD on Huntington's disease. And then she, in collaboration also with her dad, start putting together workshops to try to find a cure for the disease. And they very astutely realize that if you want to find a cure, you first have to find the cause. So they knew it's genetics. They know it's somewhere in the DNA, but you have no idea where in this 3 billion nucleotide genetic code the actual problem is that causes Huntington's disease. And so what they did, which was so smart, is they got together scientists from different fields. Because they said, the problem is this is a sort of a issue that needs to be addressed from lots of different subfields. And so they got these people together in these small workshops. And there was rules. It was like less than 10 or 15 people per workshop, and you weren't allowed to bring slide sets because they didn't want people to just click through what they know. And they brought people. It was sort of a mix of different expertise in each workshop. And eventually, they actually settle on a idea for how they're going to find the Huntington's disease gene. And there was incredible controversy at this workshop, where basically some of the people said, this approach will take more than a decade. You can't tell families that we're looking for it because we're never going to find it, and you're giving them false hope. But she basically decides to go on and help fund a few scientific researchers to find the gene. And actually, it took about 3 years. So it was actually much faster than they expected. It was this huge sensation. That part got them down to, realizing it was on chromosome 4. So we all have different chromosomes, and different genes are on different chromosomes. And with that research, they realized it was on chromosome 4. And then in 1993, they actually got the actual sequence of the gene. So it was actually Nancy Wexler's research that set the stage for genetic testing for Huntington's disease. And the sort of interesting part about it is she never decided to take the test. Years passed, and she basically said, look, I have a lot more to lose by taking the test than I have to gain. And so she never took it. And it turned out eventually she started developing writhing movements. And it started becoming apparent that she actually had developed Huntington's disease. And eventually she started talking about it. She's talked about it in a big article in the New York Times. And her sister has not developed the symptoms. So it's just sort of a remarkable story of someone changing their entire life around to study a disease that they had not intended to study, and that they're at risk for, and then ultimately developing the disease that they pioneered.
Describe some of the symptoms so we can appreciate the seriousness of the disease.
Yeah, so Huntington's disease is unusual because a lot of the early symptoms look psychiatric. So you can see people become extremely obsessive or very irritable. Sometimes people will end up using substances. You'll have someone who was never really had an addictive personality, and suddenly they're becoming, a heroin addict. And it turns out that the issue is not, actually sort of a primary psychiatric diathesis. It's actually a genetic problem. And over time, eventually, people develop these sort of writhing movements. And the way I describe it in the book is almost like there's sort of a current of electricity going through the limbs. And it's called chorea. So it's actually called Huntington's chorea. And then over time, it also leads to dementia. So people end up developing cognitive impairment and functional impairment. And then ultimately leads to death at an early age.
And comparing Huntington's and Alzheimer's or dementia, the similarities are the cognitive aspects, but Huntington has these other physical attributes as well.
Yeah, so at a sort of causative level, the big difference is Huntington's disease is always caused by what's called an expansion. So it's caused by a change in the genetic code in a particular gene every time, to the point where you can actually test someone who looks totally normal and has no symptoms. You can look at that gene and say, look, if you live on long enough, you're definitely going to develop the disease. Alzheimer's disease genetics is quite different. So Alzheimer's disease, there's very rare cases that are caused by a mutation in a single gene. There's really only about 3 genes that do this. And less than 1% of cases actually are attributable to a single gene. So, we all know folks who've suffered from Alzheimer's disease. The vast, vast majority of them, you can't point to a single gene and say, this is what caused the problem. The other type of genes that you think about with Alzheimer's disease are called risk genes. And the big one that's has the most sort of powerful effect, and the first one to be discovered, is called ApoE. But there's actually more like 70 or 80 or more risk genes. And so if you have different versions of these genes, your risk of Alzheimer's disease is, a little more or a little less, but they're not, 100%. So you couldn't look at someone's genetics with those genes and say, you're going to get the disease, you're not going to get the disease. So that's sort of a fundamental difference between the conditions. Symptomatically, the movements that you get in Huntington's disease, you don't typically get in Alzheimer's disease. And in some ways, the pattern of cognitive symptoms can be a little bit different as well. But really, the sort of most fundamental thing is that at causative level, they're a little bit different.
What are the range of first signs of Huntington's disease? What's the age range, the normal that you begin to see it begin to manifest it seriously?
So there's a huge range, and it's actually connected to the actual genetic problem. So Huntington's disease is caused by what's called an expansion. So it's basically, you have your genes, and it's sort of, it's written in this genetic code, and the letters are A, T, G, and C. And in Huntington's disease, you actually have these letters that just repeat multiple times, and they repeat too many times. And that's what causes the disease. And it turns out that the more repeats you have, the earlier the disease starts. And so you can actually have people who have a enormous amount of repeats, and they can get what's called juvenile Huntington's disease. They can get it even as children. And then you can have people who have, just over the border of abnormal, and they may get it later. And there's this phenomenon called anticipation. So the thought is that in each generation, people tend to get the disease a little bit earlier, because as the gene gets copied from at conception, you actually end up getting more repeats. So it unfortunately can strike earlier with each generation.
Closer to truth, we deal with questions of theism and atheism with arguments for both. And one argument for atheism that I heard a long time ago actually used Huntington's chorea time, to prove that God does not exist, because it was not only a terrible disease, which is normally, the problem of evil as an atheistic argument, but it was malevolent and malicious, because most people who got it at least at that time, were older and had already had children. And so it was like deliberately tormenting people. Now, I think this argument wasn't a very good one then for various reasons, but now with genetic testing, it becomes less so. But But it struck me that's, disease in general is part of the problem of evil, but Huntington's disease in particular was used in this unique way. I never forgot that.
That's so interesting. I've never heard of it I've never heard of thinking that way. It's so interesting because now I think of it as such a like purely scientific thing because it's so well established.
Yeah.
That's so interesting to think of it as an example for atheism.
Yeah, because of the malicious nature of it. Because by the time you have it, you've already had children, you already passed it on, and so it's like tormenting you in addition to the disease. All right, let's move on to frontotemporal dementia. When I did my PhD in neurophysiology, I focused a little bit on the frontal lobes, but but more evoked potentials, kind of classic neuroscience, not cognitive neuroscience. But what I found interesting is you contrast two different ways of thinking about mental diseases: focal and diffuse. Focal being if you have an injury to the temporal lobe, you may lose your capacity to understand language, so it's very specific. And the occipital lobe, you might lose your sight, so that's focal. And diffuse are the more general. You said the importance of, from a scientific point of view, of frontotemporal. You said there's something sort of special about this that is neither focal nor diffuse.
So the remarkable thing with frontotemporal dementia is the way that it changed the paradigm. So the guy who really did the pioneering work was this guy named Arnold Pick, and he worked in Prague in this asylum that was sort of underfunded and overcrowded, and he didn't have enough money for microscopic studies. So really, his big contribution was picking out these unusual patients and writing about them. And at the time, the thought was that dementia was basically a process that affected the entire brain. So if you think about, you put an ice cube in a warm room and the entire thing just melts. It's not like, one corner melts or another corner melts, assuming that the heat is well distributed. And the thought was that that's how dementia worked. It just sort of melts the entire brain. But what Pick really very astutely figured out is that there were these patients who had these particular cognitive syndromes. And when they would pass away, he would look at their brains, because there's no imaging then, so you can never actually figure out what's going on until the person dies. But he would look at their brains, and one part of the brain will have melted, and another part of the brain would look relatively normal. So it was this focal process. And before that, the idea was basically the only thing focal is essentially a stroke or an injury. So, if you get a nail through the side of the head, then that's focal, to reference a famous case. But if you have dementia, it's essentially diffuse. And what Pick showed is that dementia itself can actually be a focal process. So there's no stroke, there's no injury. But for some reason, which we now understand, but they didn't get as much then, these conditions can cause a part of the brain to get small while the rest of the brain is okay. And it causes these unusual symptoms. So the patient that I write about in the book was a patient who started having difficulty with language. And it's a condition that we now know as semantic primary progressive aphasia. But essentially, you start losing the connections between words and the objects that they signify. So when you were a kid, someone taught you that, the sound apple signifies a fruit that's green or red and has a skin and it's crunchy. But there's nothing inherent about the sound apple that actually is intrinsic to the actual object. You just made that connection. And it turns out that's largely housed in what's called the temporal pole. So you have your temporal lobes that kind of come forward by your ears, and it's the very tip of that. And that's the part of the brain that tends to be affected by this. And so people start losing the connection between words and the objects that they signify. So you'll have people who say, my husband told me to put this on the island, and I couldn't remember what the island is. Or I have a person who does lots of gardening, and she said, I was talking to a friend and they mentioned mulch, and I just couldn't quite figure out what mulch is. And so you just lose that concept. And then over time, you start losing an idea of the object itself. So you may have someone who's a chef, and suddenly they pick up a can opener and they don't know what to do with it. Because you had to be taught that as a child. That's housed in a place in your brain, and that starts getting lost in this condition. And so Pick essentially established this idea that dementia can be a focal process. And that was just a huge contribution. And he kind of had a beef with Alzheimer, who lived around the same time. And Alzheimer is actually the one who discovered the sort of the initial did the initial microscopic work on the disease. But eventually, one of Pick's students basically booted Alzheimer's out of the history and called everything Pick's disease. So it's sort of also a good historical example of a scientific feud.
Okay, but a very serious contribution to understanding the whole process of how dementia works. Let's go on to the rebels, the aberrant proteins that can cause psychosis. You talk about Creutzfeldt's Jacob disease, another terrible disease.
Yeah, so this is really a new model for neurologic disease. And the story goes back to initially the 1950s. And there was this guy, Vincent Zigas, and he was a public health worker. He'd been born in Estonia, and then he'd sort of trained in Europe and ultimately decided he wants to get out of Europe. Goes to Australia, joins the public health service there, and then gets sent to Papua New Guinea, to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. He talks about in a book that he was initially told he's just going to be sort of do medicine, and he gets there and there's no other sort of trained physician. He starts learning how to do surgery, and he really becomes very sort of involved in the community. And a few years goes by and he meets this person who starts talking about this disease called Kuru. And Zigas sort of says, look, I'm the physician in the area. I should know what this is, but I've never heard of this. And the person who's telling him about it says, look, it's this relatively new disease, and it's affecting women and children, and it causes them to laugh uncontrollably. It causes them to shake, and then it kills them. And the guy says, well, Zigas, I'll show you the disease. So he sends someone to pick Zigas up at his cottage, and they go off into the highlands and they start seeing people with the disease. And nobody knows what's causing it, but it seems to be spreading, and it seems to affect mainly this one tribe called the Four tribe. And so Zigas comes back. He writes letters to people all over the world saying, like, have you ever seen anything like this? I have no idea what this is. Can you help me? Doesn't get anything back. And he does another trip and he sends out more letters. And eventually he actually has another scientist join him. And they set up shop in the middle of the highlands, kind of in this cottage. And they start meeting with people from the tribe, and folks start contributing the brains of people who have died from the disease. So it becomes this really collaborative effort. So Zigas and his partner start, making microscopic sort of slides of samples from people who died of this disease, and they send it out to the US and to other places, and they actually put together a exhibit in a museum in London, and they start finally getting a little bit of help. So they have someone from the US who says, look, at a microscopic level, this looks a lot like this disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which was discovered in the 20s. It was named after Creutzfeldt, who was sort of a Nazi, and Jakob, who was a victim of the Nazis. And so this guy says, look, maybe there's a connection between them, but we don't know what causes Creutzfeldt-Jakob either. So it's a little helpful, but doesn't get you to the answer. And then at this exhibit in London, where they show pictures of the microscopic findings in Kuru, there's actually a veterinarian who says, I study this disease in sheep, and this looks a lot like what I see in the sheep's brains. And so that sort of brings together the trifecta of these initial diseases that are called spongiform encephalopathies, because basically under a microscope, it looks like a sponge. It looks like spots of the brain has kind of melted away. And the disease, essentially, nobody can quite figure out what's causing it. And eventually some anthropologists start to give a hand, and they actually figure out that the way that Kuru was being spread was in the brains of people who had died from it. So it turned out that the tradition in the Four tribe, it was what's called endocannibalism. So when someone from their own tribe died, they would eat the brain. And it was typically after the funerary practice, the women would eat the brain and they would bring the extras home for the children. And so that's why it hit women and children. And so they figured out sort of the anthropologic explanation, but they still didn't know what was going on at a microscopic level. Initially, the thought was this was infectious, but it didn't really behave like an infectious disease from a epidemiologic perspective. And so it went unsolved for a long time. And then this neurologist in the 80s started looking at the disease And what he realized actually is that, this was a infectious disease, but it wasn't caused by any of the typical agents. So you think of infections, if you go to the hospital and you have a pneumonia, you worry about a bacteria or a virus, or maybe it's a fungus, or some things can be caused by a parasite. But there's nothing like that in this disease, in Kuru, in Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and Scrapie. And what this scientist, Stanley Prusiner, discovers is that the infectious agent is actually a protein. And so proteins are so much smaller. All of these things, these big cells like bacteria and viruses, they have, millions and billions of proteins in them. But here, it's this super small entity. It's a protein that's causing the infection. And people said, that doesn't make any sense because a protein can't replicate. How could it cause an infection? You have to be able to, divide and multiply. So how could a protein do it? And what Prusiner really discovered is that it's a matter of protein folding. So proteins have these incredibly complex three-dimensional structures, and that's what allows them to do their work. And there are certain proteins where they misfold, and then they have this special power to cause other proteins to misfold. And there's a journalist who basically describes it as a room full of mousetraps. So if you have a room full of mousetraps and one goes off, they'll all go off. And it's basically the same idea. And Prusiner was really ridiculed at the beginning, and now has been, won a Nobel Prize for it, which is about, as much validation as you can get for your work. And now it's become really very well accepted that that's what these diseases are caused by. And he sort of moved on to saying, maybe all of these even more common diseases actually have some relation to this protein problem. He calls them prion, which is a combination of protein and infection. And the thought is, maybe that's also a part of the pathology for Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease.
And that's become controversial because that many people don't accept that.
Exactly. It's very, very controversial. But it's also led to some work. There's a condition called Lewy body disease. And some of the tests that you use for prion diseases are actually now being used as potential tests for Lewy body disease. So it's just sort of expanded the field incredibly. And you're exactly right. It's really quite controversial still in other ways.
Yeah, but it's very good to challenge current belief, expand our thinking, because you never know where the truth is going to lie. And it's very good to find people with passion for their own ideas and let it be tested in the marketplace of scientific discovery and critique.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the invaders, these foreign substances. We normally think of environmental pollution or toxic drugs or things that can enter the body that have these dramatic cognitive impact. Mercury is one of the examples you use.
Yeah, so the story I tell in the book actually has to do with Abraham Lincoln. There's been speculation that he may have suffered from mercury poisoning, and the idea was brought up by this actually infectious disease doctor named Norbert Hirschhorn. And he became extraordinarily famous actually for developing oral rehydration therapy. So he's credited with saving millions of lives. And on the side, he's a medical historian. And so he was reading Gore Vidal's novel Lincoln one day, and he reads this excerpt that basically talks about someone mentioning Lincoln taking a substance called blue mass. And Hirschhorn, who is now, I think, in his 80s or 90s, in medical school had actually learned about blue mass, which is long off the market and not used anymore. But he had learned that the key ingredient in blue mass is mercury. And so he started wondering, maybe that's actually, clinically significant. And if you go back, there's a fair amount of accounts of Lincoln supposedly using blue mass, and it was used pretty frequently then. There's some debate about why he used it. There's some thought he used it for constipation. There's another thought that he used it for depression. And sort of most convincingly is this quote from one of his close colleagues that Lincoln was using blue mass up until the point he got elected, and then soon after he became president, he stopped using it, and the quote is because it made him cross. And so it's implying that Lincoln suffered a medication side effect. And we think of Lincoln as being essentially in the same state as his statue, sort of emotionally immovable, incredibly level-headed, thoughtful. I think if we all imagine having ever asked him a question, you would think there'd be a long pause before he would answer. And that's our image of him. But when you look back, there's actually stories of him being relatively sort of rash and quick to anger. Yeah, so there's a story of him when he was working on his last case before he stopped practicing law. There was a piece of evidence that he wanted to get admitted, and the judge basically said, "We're not going to admit it." And he erupted and actually lunged over the judge's sort of barrier. And the accounts are like, it looked like he was sort of a lion that was about to attack. And there's a story from the Lincoln Douglas debates where he's on the stage and someone accuses him of not supporting the troops in a war. And he basically looks to someone else on the stage and says, you have to defend me. And he drags them up by their neck and shakes them. And his bodyguard basically has to pull him off. So there's these stories of him acting very un-Lincoln-like. And the idea that Hirschhorn had is that, maybe these are actually triggered by mercury toxicity, which we know can cause this volatility. So they actually, they went back to the pharmacology textbooks from the era, and Hirschhorn and one of his colleagues actually recreated blue mass in a laboratory. And they did some sort of simulation, and they couldn't test it on people, but they did some simulations, and they basically figured out that it would give people a really quite toxic amount of mercury at the dose that people were prescribing in that era. And ultimately, it comes down to speculation because you can't prove it. If the idea is that Lincoln stopped taking it soon after he got elected, then by the time he's assassinated, any samples from from his body from that point wouldn't have mercury anymore because it would have been so many years later. So we'll never really know what the truth is behind it. But it just sort of, I think, brings up the idea of side effects that we most people take some sort of prescribed medication, and we don't really think about how it affects our relationships.
Good. Let's move on to the invaders and vitamins, which you tell the story of wonderfully. Is the classic case. And what's always fascinating is some of these diseases have multiple symptoms. They look very complicated, but if you isolate this fairly small molecule that is a vitamin, it can quickly and immediately cure all these complicated things. You use the story of thiamine, vitamin B1 deficiency, and a fascinating story with Joseph Goldberger curing pellagra. With his filth experiment. So you're going to tell us the whole story of vitamins.
The story of pellagra with Joseph Goldberger is sort of a wild story. So the disease itself causes dermatitis, so it causes a rash, usually on the areas that are exposed to the sun. So it's on the face, on the hands, sort of on the neck. It causes terrible diarrhea, and it causes dementia. And it had existed in Europe for some time, and the thought, it was sort of often in Italy, and people thought it was caused by spoiled corn. But the thought was that essentially that North America was immune to it, or that the United States was basically immune to the disease. But in the early 1900s, they start seeing pellagra crop up in orphanages and prisons, in sort of relatively impoverished areas in the primarily in the southeastern U.S. And the disease really scares people because it's deadly, and we don't really know what's causing it. There's this idea that it's caused by spoiled corn, but no one's ever really proved it. And the disease starts getting more and more common. And initially, it's really in among poor people, and so it's not getting that much attention. And then it starts sort of spreading even outside. So you have people who are farmers who are starting to get it. And you get headlines in the national news that basically say, this killer, this, murderer of a disease is exploding in incidence. They start getting an influence from a Italian infectious disease doctor who basically says, this is not caused by a toxin in spoiled corn. It's actually caused by an infection that's transmitted by flies. And he basically says it with no evidence, but he gained some fame for some other reasons. And so people listen to him. And people also like that idea because you basically could say, look, here's a disease that affects poor people, and it's caused by their terrible sanitation, and it's their fault. And so the government doesn't have to do anything. So it became a much easier problem to tackle when you could blame it on the victims. But Again, there's no proof and there's no treatment, and it starts getting more and more common. So finally, in the early 1910s, the Surgeon General calls on this guy, Joseph Goldberger, and says, can you give us a hand? And Goldberger had come to the US at age 9, speaking no English. And he'd worked delivering groceries for his father's grocery store in the Lower East Side. And there was the story that he would like hide books in his coat. So he would deliver some groceries and then hide in the hallway and do some reading and then go back. So he was always very he was always a sort of curious guy. He went to medical school, tried to practice and couldn't make enough money, and then had joined the public health service. And he'd already contracted many of the diseases that he had studied. So he'd gotten yellow fever, he'd gotten typhus, he'd gotten typhoid. And that was sort of the accepted thing is, when you take on an assignment, you may be, you're not just studying it, you're becoming part of it. And, but nevertheless, he agrees to take on this assignment to study pellagra. And so he starts where he always starts, which is at the library. That's where he always sort of bases all of his projects. And he starts reading about these conferences that have been done on pellagra, where people have gathered and given lectures. And he very quickly realizes that this can't be an infectious disease because you have all these hospitals taking care of people with pellagra, but the staff at the hospitals never gets it. So you can imagine if all these people and the staff are getting bitten by the same flies, because the staff often lives with, they live in the same place, they often live with their patients. How is it that only the patients are getting the disease? And so he very quickly says, look, I think this is a problem in the diet, but he's not convinced that this is a toxin in corn. He actually starts thinking about maybe it's, a problem where people's diets are missing something. Maybe that's what causes pellagra. But he's not quite sure, and he's not quite sure what they'd be missing. So the first experiment he does is he goes to a orphanage and he changes up the food. So they were eating tons of corn-based products. And he says, instead of corn, why don't we have, eggs and beans and all sorts of other sort of richer foods. And sure enough, he basically eradicates pellagra from the orphanage. And so he says, look, I've treated the disease. This is the best you can hope for. But the government says, that's a very expensive treatment to suddenly feed everyone and to feed everyone nutritionally sort of hefty food. And so nobody really pays much attention to his recommendations. So then he says, all right, I'm going to go prove that I can actually cause pellagra. So he goes to a prison that happened to have a very diverse diet, and he looks for volunteers to volunteer for his 6-month study. He needs 12 volunteers, 80 people volunteer, and he chooses 12 of them. And it turns out they say, basically, this is the worst experience of my entire life being part of this study. They eat grits and molasses and basically these incredibly sort of carbohydrate-rich but nutrient-devoid foods for 6 months. And in the end, they kind of hobble into the office to get their release from prison. And the Jackson Daily News essentially publishes this article that says they ate their way to freedom. So it's sort of obviously a very sort of morally complicated study, or morally complex and problematic study. But that's how they proved that changing diet could cause pellagra. But still, they don't get the attention that they need. And so Goldberger basically says, I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to show you that this is not an infectious disease. So he does a series of experiments. The first one he does, he takes a sample of blood from a patient with pellagra, and he injects it into his own shoulder and the shoulder of a very devoted colleague. And they say, look, our shoulders were really sore for a little bit, but otherwise we were okay. So he gets a little bit bolder, and he starts making these tablets, these pills, and he makes them by scraping off scales from pellagra patients' rashes, and he takes their stool and their urine and he mixes it all up and puts it into a tablet and ingests it. And he gets more and more of his colleagues to volunteer. And even his wife, actually, who they've had sort of a rocky relationship because he's always going off to different states or different countries to study these diseases and potentially die from them. And she's sort of stuck home with the kids. But she finally says, I want to participate. So he won't let her swallow the tablets, but he does take a sample of blood from someone with pellagra. It had to be a female patient with pellagra, lest you would mix. So he takes the blood from a female patient with pellagra and injects it into her abdomen. So eventually, about 6 months after they do these experiments, he writes up this report with this kind of comical conclusion that basically says, considering the amounts of filth that we took in, it's pretty amazing that none of us got pellagra. And so he sort of says, look, I've put to bed this idea that this is a infection. He goes on to do another set of experiments, and finally the world basically accepts that he's correct. And so then he goes on to say, look, I got to find out what the actual missing ingredient is that's causing this disease. And so he uses this model of dogs that have a similar disease that's called black tongue. And he basically takes lots of different foods and he says, which of these foods can cure the disease in dogs, with the thought that, maybe the foods that can cure it they all have something in common at a molecular level. And he gets far enough to say, look, I think it's caused by a deficiency in some sort of B vitamin. We all know when you go to the drugstore, you could get a multi-B complex, there's B12, there's B1. At that point, they didn't really know about all of those. But he says, look, I think it's something in that complex, but he can't quite put his finger on what it is. And then he actually dies. So he never gets to the very bottom of it. He was nominated for a Nobel Prize 4 times in his life, but never won. And he ultimately sort of gets to that, nearly to the end of saying it's a deficiency in a B vitamin, and that's it. And then it turns out that it's other scientists who figure out that it's a deficiency in vitamin B3 or niacin. Initially, it was called nicotinic acid, and it turns out that vitamin was actually sitting on the shelf of the laboratory of the guy who had coined the word vitamin. But he had used it to try to cure a different disease that was caused by a different vitamin deficiency, so it hadn't worked. So the cure was actually sitting on the shelf the entire time for the sort of 3 or 4 decades when this disease ravaged the United States. And it was even cheap. It was like 10 cents to treat this disease, but nobody knew that was the cure. And ultimately, they started putting vitamins into flour and cereals. And that's why you don't really see those diseases anymore. And the trouble that they ran into initially is that it was called nicotinic acid. And so people started getting confused between nicotinic acid and nicotine. So you got headlines like, cigarettes in your bread. And so they convened this conference of bakers, and they came up with a few different possibilities for alternative names, and niacin won out. And that's why it's called niacin when you go to the drugstore and pick it up.
Yeah, all the stories of the critical interventions of vitamin supplements. It's also true with minerals, which are real, have actually caused what could be the opposite kind of toxicity problem, where people take hyperdoses and megadoses of different vitamins with the theory of a little bit can make you better, a lot can make you much better and cure various diseases, and that creates its own toxicity. So virtually every vitamin has been given in these huge doses, and you can see when you buy things 5,000% of normal, 50 times the normal, and you think, well, that's great, and that's oftentimes very bad.
You're exactly right that it's gone the other direction. Most of us are not deficient in any vitamins, and when we see folks in clinic, often people say, which vitamin should I be buying? And the answer really is, unless you can prove that you're deficient in it, you don't really need it.
Right.
And the one we really think of is B12. That's the most common vitamin deficiency that you see causing cognitive symptoms in sort of everyday life. But even, most people aren't actually deficient, so most people don't actually need to take it. But yeah, you're exactly right that it's swung completely the opposite direction.
And if you do, I sometimes take a multiple vitamin. I take about a quarter of what they recommend, and I do it because it has a very nice placebo effect. So I give in to my own superstition by taking very little, so it's not toxic, and enough to kind of give you that placebo effect. Seems to work. So
so far so good.
So what I want to talk to you seriously about, I mean, the work that you're doing and the work that these scientists did was a major contribution. But do we have, and again, in the area of the pendulum swinging the other direction, is there a danger today of reducing all mental aberrations to molecules, seeking a pharmacological solution as the primary protocol? And it's an easier route. I mean, you just prescribe something. What, in your opinion, seeing the power of molecular medicine in cognitive issues, what is the role of various talk therapies, which is obviously harder, more expensive, more uncertain? For example, in phobias or in OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, where techniques of desensitization or habituation therapies, exposure and response therapies. These are all kind of cognitive behavioral therapies, seem to work, at least in some cases. What is your feeling in terms of being overconfident in pharmacological solutions to cognitive problems?
Yeah, so I think, I have to say, for the most part, the idea is that these should work synergistically. So we use a lot of talk therapy in our treatments. That the limitation that we sometimes encounter is at some point in the course of dementia, some people lose insight or they have language problems. And so then talk therapy, it doesn't help that much. If part of the disease is losing insight into the disease, talking through it's not going to help. And if part of the disease is not being able to speak, talk therapy is problematic. But other than that, so when people who are milder or aren't having language problems, we use it extremely often, because even though, in trying to find a cure, these types of diseases, I think, will ultimately come to a molecular solution. I think that is the wave of the future. That is where we are going. When you look at all the trials for Alzheimer's disease, the vast majority are targeted at particular molecules. But in terms of how you cope with the disease, that's a totally different question. And talk therapy is extraordinarily useful, both for our patients, but also for their caregivers.
And also for different types of cognitive disease. As I said, I mentioned, beyond dementia. Will expand your remit beyond dementia. For other kinds of cognitive issues, again, I mentioned phobias or obsessive compulsive disorders. Talk therapy, at least at this stage, may be a primary one, although ultimately, at least in OCD, that might be a molecular solution as well.
In so many of the talks that I've given, someone raises their hand and says, do we have a molecular cause for schizophrenia yet? And it's not my field. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm certainly not, trained enough to speak to it. But I think you're exactly right that there's this thought too of, we have to push all of these things towards a molecular solution. And I don't think they all will end up having a molecular solution. They're not all going to be uniform diseases.
I think that's a very important point. My experience with schizophrenia and the molecular solution was when I was in first year medical school, and this was in the early 60s. Very famous biochemist Seymour Ketty came in and he said, he told the story of a group of scientists feeling absolutely certain that they had isolated the schizophrenia ward in the mental institution, and all of them had one type of metabolite that none other had. They published their papers until somebody pointed out they were given a different brand of coffee in that in the schizophrenia ward, and that was the metabolite of the coffee. So we have to be careful. As a dementia doctor, just take me through, without a specific patient, what do you literally do? Let's say, I come into your office or bring a parent or whatever. What are just a few minutes of the process of the kind of activities that you have?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is people come in with a family member or a friend typically. And that's one thing that makes our visits different than, when you go to, a different doctor typically. Right. And so the beginning really is figuring out what's the narrative, what's happened, both in the perspective of the patient and the perspective of the person they've come with, because these are not always the same thing. And we know, in Alzheimer's disease, one of the earliest things is many people lose insight into what's going on. There's a little bit of a sort of adage in the field of, if the patient comes in and says, I'm having a problem, and the spouse says they're fine, then they're probably okay. But if the patient says, I'm totally fine, and the spouse says they can't remember anything, you've got a problem. So a lot of it is figuring out, what's the narrative and what's the impression of what's happened over time in both perspectives. And in particular, what was the early symptoms? Because all these diseases, at the end, they all look the same. It's someone who's frail, who's in bed, who's not moving, who's not vocalizing, picking up bed sheets. They look the same at the very end, but at the beginning, they look very different. And so what we try to do is pick out from the story, what are the different clues that can help us figure out what's going on? So the first question is there a neurodegenerative process going on? And that's, a first big question we ask ourselves. And you think of that on two levels. So one is, what's someone's function like? Do they have functional impairment? Are they not able to do things that they used to do? And the other is, can we use the symptoms that they're having and the cognitive testing that we do to try to figure out, what's going on in their brain under a microscope, even though we can't touch the brain. So basically what we're using is lots and lots of different proxies to try to figure out what's going on in the brain at a microscopic level without ever accessing the brain. And that's really the name of the game in terms of what we're trying to do. And so part of this is that cognitive testing. So we ask people to to remember things and draw things and repeat things, and all sorts of tasks that seem strange but actually have been well validated in teaching us about what their how is their executive function, meaning their multitasking or organization, or their memory, or do they have a particular language problem? Do they have trouble seeing borders and space? And so you take their history, you take the cognitive testing, oftentimes we get imaging, and then you try to put it all together and say, what's the problem? So dementia basically just means there's a progressive process that's causing people to have functional impairment, but it's not that useful of a term because it doesn't tell you what's really going on. The question we're saying is, what's the cause of dementia? What's the microscopic problem? Is it Alzheimer's disease? Is it Lewy body disease? Is it frontotemporal dementia? Is it something else?
Do the initial signs in those cases differ, or are they all relatively similar, forgetting things or disorientation?
So there's some overlap, but classically they actually are quite different. So the classic Alzheimer's disease is a pure memory problem. Frontotemporal dementia typically either starts with behavioral problems, so people become really socially inappropriate or apathetic, or these unusual language problems. And Lewy body disease, the classic story is someone who shows up and says, I've been seeing people and I know that they're not real, but they look really vivid to me. Or I see animals and they look real. So they have these well-formed hallucinations, and they're not threatening, but they're really, surprising. Or you might have them say, their spouse sometimes will say, their sleep's become so active, I had to put bed rails on the bed because otherwise they'll fall out of bed. Or I've gotten punched, I've had to go to the emergency room because they punched me while they were sleeping. And so they actually have, these different profiles at the beginning, and there's some overlap. So we're not perfect, but they do look different at the beginning, and that's sort of what helps us sort it out.
So I have this little cup where I put my gym keys, because if I don't put it in that cup, I'm going to forget where I put it. And, maybe I should worry about that, except I've been using that little cup for keys since I've been 16 years old and couldn't find my keys in college in my dorm room. So I'm not so worried. But let me tell you seriously, my mother had dementia. She died at 102 about 5 years ago. She had dementia for a few years. Only in the last year or so was it very serious, where she'd go months without being able to say a word, yet she recognized me when I was there. Yet when she had music therapy, which we had a couple times a week, she could sing the old songs fluently, and did. But other than the music, had absolutely not a word. I'm not saying, very little, zero for months on end, except during music therapy.
Yeah, so that's this incredible demonstration of how focal these brain processes can be. It's sort of that's what was established with frontotemporal dementia with the history, is it's not, the whole brain's not gone. There are parts that are preserved, and music often tends to be in the more common forms of dementia. Music is often preserved. The other thing that sometimes is preserved in some of them is sort of procedural things. So you'll have people who were, someone who was a famous ballerina who could still do the moves that they did when they were 16, even though they have no idea who their daughter is. So you get these sort of very strange phenomena, and we actually try to capitalize on that when we think about keeping people engaged. So one of the things that we know slows down dementia is keeping people sort of intellectually and socially engaged. But it's hard to do if they can't follow directions. How do you engage someone? Right. But music is, one huge tool for that. It's really just remarkable.
Yeah, and what was remarkable, not only did my mother keep the beat with her foot but with her hand, but she verbalized the words fairly accurately. So it was verbal, and so there was the recall, the ability to recall the specific words of the songs, even though she didn't know what the words meant at that time. I have to tell you a couple of incidents that occurred, because it so struck me. And again, this is after months and months of zero talk of any kind. There were two incidents, and I'd go there many times a week and sit there and be with her, and I'd be working on my computer because I couldn't talk to her. And I knew she didn't like that. She wanted me to pay more attention to her, even though we weren't able to talk. But I still had to do things like Closer to Truth or whatever I was doing. So I was working on my computer. And so suddenly, we were in a commons room, there were a lot of people around. After not talking for months, she looked at me and said, in perfect sentence English, and she was a very good student in her young days. She said, "With all that junk you're doing on that machine, at least are you making any money?" I mean, it was a startling thing that shocked everybody in the room. And in fact, I was working on it closer to truth, and I wasn't making money. But it was in perfect English. And the other occasion, and this is the only two times this has happened, again, after months of silence, again, we're in a big room, assisted living. Suddenly, to a nurse, she said in perfect English, "It's not that I cannot speak. It's that I don't want to talk to you." She was a very feisty lady, but what struck me was the fluency and the power and the perfectly well thought after months of total silence and then back into silence.
And that's, so it's actually, it's a common phenomenon, and we don't really know why it happens. There's this sort of thought of like, well, the wires aren't totally connected, but maybe there's some connection, and occasionally some signal gets through, and voila, you have something that sounds cogent. But we really don't know why that happens. But we hear it often. We'll hear people, similar, someone who hasn't said a word in months, and they'll turn and say, love you to their partner.
Yeah.
And it's these really, it's also a complex thing to experience, because for partners, it's uplifting and fulfilling and wonderful, and then it goes away, and it's hard to watch that.
Yeah, but it did tell me that there's somebody really there. There's somebody really there. So I mean, I'm telling it in a maybe a silly way, but it was very profound at the time.
It's interesting the way that you tell it, because I think that also reflects the way we usually see it, which is the things that come out usually are things that are sort of typical of the person's personality. So it usually is it's these things where the people around say, "Oh, that's totally them."
Yeah, right.
And so it often is reflective.
Yeah, I know. In my mother, that was 100%. I mean, there was no doubt. There was no ventriloquist in the background. That's for sure. Are there lifestyle changes that can reduce the likelihood of dementia, especially if there are genetic proclivities?
Yeah, and there's good studies on this. So there's, don't smoke, don't drink too much.
Right.
But also exercise has some of the best data. There was a study looking at people with genetic causes of frontotemporal dementia. So these are people who, if they live long enough, they're essentially almost definitely going to get disease. And it turned out that the top exercisers progressed 50% slower than the people who didn't exercise, which is no drug has that big of an effect on dementia. It's a huge, huge effect. And most of the studies, it's something like 30 to 40 minutes a day, 3 to 4 days of something aerobic. And that seems to be, there's some effect of anaerobic stuff, but it really seems to be aerobic activity that gives people the biggest benefit. The other big piece is social engagement. So there's a study back in the 80s that looked at how many social connections people have. So you essentially got a point for having a spouse, a point for having a community, a point for, talking to family at least, a time a week or so. And they looked, and basically the more points you had, the slower you decline. And that's been demonstrated over and over again. And the other piece is intellectual activity. And there's really no data for like a particular type of intellectual activity. So it's not like we don't tell folks to go sign up for Lumosity or, something else. You don't have to buy a Sudoku book. If you don't like Sudoku, don't do it. It's really a matter of what people enjoy, because that's what they'll actually engage in. Whether that's reading a book, whether it's listening to a podcast, whether it's watching Closer to Truth, it's really a matter of finding something that you can participate in. And that also becomes a moving target, because as people get more impaired, their intellectual capacity changes. But the goal is to find something at each level that they can engage in. And the last piece, I mean, there's other things, but the other big piece that we talk to people out is diet. But diet, it's a complex thing, in part because it's hard to study. If I asked you, what did you eat yesterday? I suspect the list that you make would not be entirely accurate. And if I told you to eat certain foods for the next 3 months, I suspect you wouldn't completely listen to me. So it's hard to figure out what people have actually eaten, and it's hard to change what people do. The bulk of studies suggest that the Mediterranean diet, or the MIND diet, which is sort of a variant of that, the bulk of studies really point to that being the most beneficial diet from a cognitive perspective. But just a few months ago, there was a paper in the main neurology journal that basically said, we looked at this and that made no difference at all. So it's really, it's a little harder. So I tend to say, look, these diseases take things away from people. And so you can't be perfect. And so, for diet, I tend to just say, look, everything in moderation and focus more on exercise and social engagement and intellectual engagement,
Yeah,
because there's just really strong data for those.
that makes sense. On the intellectual side, I know there have been companies that have been started that make various promises about mental games, and a lot of that has been proven to be ineffective. It's certainly not damaging, but it is not as advertised, shall we say. But some studies that I recall is that when you do mental things that are hard, that are different than you've done, learning a new musical instrument at an advanced age, or learning a new language that is just struggled. I have that experience of difficult learning a new language. That actually has a better statistical impact. Is that true?
Yes, yeah. So doing new things is great. The thing that you run into with things like, like lumosity is, if you do lumosity, you'll get better at lumosity, but that doesn't mean you're going to actually get better in everyday life.
Right.
But you're exactly right. Learning new skills is really you get a lot of bang for your buck for that.
Good. I'm trying to learn a ping pong a very tough backhand. So that's
Is
my I
that
get my aerobics and my
physical
mental.
activity, social?
Yeah, less social. I'm not very social when I'm trying to do that, but the aerobics and the mental challenge, that's what I'm up for. How about people who are just diagnosed with early stage dementia? Are the lifestyle changes the same to try to slow it, as opposed to just prophylactically to try to stop preventative? Is there any differences?
There's not really a big difference. So these have been studied in both contexts. So it's been studied in people who are cognitively normal, and it's been studied with people who
Right.
have diagnoses. And it turns out it's really about the same. It's really the same approach.
Look, I'm going to throw kind of a curveball question at you, and that deals with, again, one of Closer to Truth's core areas. We have these three big core areas. One is cosmology, and second is consciousness, the nature, and the third is meaning, where we deal with questions in theology and atheism. So, in the question of consciousness, the big question, if we had to put one question, is consciousness the inner phenomenology, the phenomenal consciousness of this inner experience that we have, is it 100% physical? Everybody knows has to relate to the brain, but is the brain? Well, we know it's necessary, but is it sufficient? So that's the big question. And many physicalists argue that all the precise correlations between physical properties or physical characteristics that you exhibit, and the physical cause for that demonstrates that consciousness is entirely physical. And arguments, and really every piece of data in your book, although that's not your purpose, every piece of data in your book would be used by those people who say that consciousness is 100% physical, and just read Dr. Peskin's book if you're not convinced. And certainly all that would be convincing. Are you convinced that that's the case?
So I should say I'm a horrible philosopher. So I don't know if my thoughts have any validity, but my sense from studying this stuff is we've learned a lot about ways where you can destroy consciousness. So there's lots of different ways where we can have a certain stroke and someone's suddenly unconscious, or a trauma and someone's unconscious. But we are not actually that far in figuring out the constructive aspect of it. How is consciousness actually built from the ground up? And it's hard for me to imagine ever getting to a point where science can actually say, you can actually build consciousness from the ground up to the point of the human brain. There really seems to be still something kind of inaccessible about the essence of the human brain. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that. It's really understanding how it's constructed. Most of science or most of what we study is, it's disease. It's where, there's a problem, and then you can go back and say, oh, well, clearly this part was necessary, but it's exactly as you're saying. We can figure out what pieces are necessary for consciousness, but I don't see us being anywhere close to actually understanding sort of the essence of it. And maybe I'm just too short-sighted, but but I have a hard time seeing it.
Sounds like you're a pretty good philosopher to me. Many thanks, Sarah. It's really a terrific book, recommended for everybody. A great read. A Molecule Away from Madness, Tales of the Hijacked Brain. Viewers can watch hundreds of videos on consciousness, brain-mind interactions when brains go bad on the Closer to Truth website and Closer to Truth YouTube channel. Thank you again, Sarah, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.